Oui, allô. Alors, aujourd'hui, je vais vous parler de basketball. Mathieu?
Je vais parler de hyènes anciennes et de fossiles.
Merci Mathieu.
And I will be speaking about Canadian efforts to support human rights campaigners.
Für mich, das war Mittagessen und Kartoffeln und Salat. And welcome once again to The Link Online with scenes from across Canada to open the program. If you're watching us on the internet or on Facebook, because we're on Facebook Live. And the music is slowly disappearing out of the way. I don't know what's going on. We have the wonderful Canadian flag there once again, shining bright in the light of the sunlight. And we are here shining bright in the lights of the studio. And with me today we have, of course, Marie-Claude Simard.
Hi, everybody.
Oh. Dramatic music.
Hello, everybody.
And we welcome Matthew Leiser to the program.
Hello, everybody.
And Matthew will be filling in, well, he's filling in today for Lynn, who is off, but Matthew will be filling in from time to time in the future on the program. So welcome to Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
And of course, we have Levon Savunts with us.
Hello.
And in the control room, we have Carl Boulanger and Benoit Durand. And of course, last but not least, we have Pierre Dutil making funny signs at me. We'll find out what that's all about. I think he's into sign language. Oh, he's talking.
I think he's.
Oh, he's talking about this
about
thing. It's a secret. It's a secret thing. It's there you go.
We're not supposed to know it's there.
Well, it's like a secret agent thing. Yes, it's a secret agent thing. You got the things in your ears, like this. There we are. There's a suspicious character to my right here. In fact, there's several suspicious characters. Over. We have, of course, listeners on World Radio Paris. We'd like to say hello to you, and the shortwave service in Germany, and Kauri Radio 97.5 in Nigeria. So hello to all of you listening to us. And of course, if you are listening to us and would like to drop us a line to say hello, we'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely.
It's always good to hear from you. Now, on the program today, we have, of course, some interesting things about life in Canada and Canadian opinions on things. And we'll start out with you, Levon. What do you have?
Well, I'll be speaking with a human rights campaigner about Canada's latest efforts to support human rights defenders worldwide.
Okay, Matthew?
I have a story about an intriguing discovery in the Arctic. 2 very unusual ancient fossils.
All right. And I'll be talking about the situation in the Middle East, which we know almost came to a head again with the conflict between U.S. and Iran. And Marie-Claude, you have something interesting for us as well.
Yes, I'll tell you about a very popular topic in Canada lately, basketball, and I'll show you very interesting archive videos.
And this is not to do with the Raptors.
Exactly.
Nothing to do with Raptors, surprisingly.
Because if you are not aware, around the world, the Raptors, a Toronto-based team, won the National Basketball Association Championship. And there was a massive amount of hoopla about that because, of course, it's the first time a Canadian team, or Canadian-based team, if nothing else, won the NBA championships.
But we've had champions before in that sport.
Oh, boy. Well, that's what you're going to tell
Exactly.
us about. All right. Well, let's start out with the situation, very serious situation in the Middle East. It almost exploded, literally, this week, following U.S. allegations that Iran was responsible for attacks on oil tankers off its coast. And then came an Iranian missile attack on a U.S. drone. And today we're hearing that the U.S. had, in fact, launched a retaliatory strike, which would have seen radar and missile stations destroyed, and that would have resulted in an estimated about 150 deaths. But with just minutes to spare, the U.S. President Trump called off the strike, saying it would have been a disproportionate response to the downing of the American drone. Now, all this seems to fit closely with the assessment by a Canadian professor of political science who noted the danger in the region of a wider conflict. Rex Brynan teaches at Montreal's McGill University, and I started by asking him about the causes of this U.S.-Iran tension.
The most immediate cause is a series of mysterious tanker explosions for which Iran was very likely responsible, which has led to the Americans increasing their military presence in the Gulf. The other sort of broader long-term cause has been the shift of U.S. policy under the Trump administration. Of course, the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and moreover, it's done its best to undermine it. It's tightened sanctions on Iran. It's tried to prevent any country really from trading with Iran. It's diminished Iran's ability to export oil. And at times, people in the administration have said things either recently or in the past, which Tehran understands as threats of destabilizing the Iranian regime. I think if Iran is responsible for these tanker explosions, what it's trying to do is signal to the United States, look, there's a potential cost of messing with us, of undermining our economy. Look what we can do to world oil supplies going through the Straits of Hormuz.
So why, again, is the United States angry at Iran in the first place?
The American-Iranian relationship has been fraught ever since the Iranian Revolution, the embassy seizure, and so forth. Iran does a number of things in the Middle East that the U.S. doesn't like. It supports Hezbollah in Lebanon. It supports the Syrian government. It supports Shiite militias in Iraq. It supports the Houthis in Yemen. And generally, the U.S. sees Iran as a destabilizing influence. So there's always been a bad relationship. Now, under the Obama administration, the nuclear deal was signed along with the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese, which was just a deal about nuclear power and weapons and technology. It really wasn't a deal about broader Iranian behavior. The Trump administration withdrew from that deal, even though we all knew the Iranians were abiding by it, partly because they say Iran should have to stop doing these other things as well. But I think the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese just don't think it's reasonable to expect the Iranians to entirely alter their regional foreign policy, even if there's parts of it that are unhelpful or we don't like. So there's long-standing tensions with regard to Iran, but those have got much worse under the Trump administration.
Are there potential flashpoints here, an accident that could happen that could escalate the situation?
I think there are three ways the situation could go very bad very quickly. One is that someone takes an action which provokes an overreaction and we get to a chain of escalation. So there's another Iranian shipping attack which leads the U.S. to engage in a retaliatory attack, and one thing leads to another. The second is that there's simply an accident. We've got an area which is now full of naval vessels and aircraft. It only takes either sloppy navigation or a reckless commander to have one ship ram another, for one plane to hit another. It happening right now between the Iranians and the Americans would be very dangerous. And thirdly, it's got to be remembered, this is not just the U.S. and Iran. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Israelis, the Houthis in Yemen who've been conducting attacks against Saudi Arabia. There are other actors in the region too, and they could do something which could drag the United States or Iran into a broader confrontation. So unpredictable actions by allies. I mean, think how unpredictable and reckless Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, is. So the Saudis could do something, for example, that makes things worse. So there's all those possibilities of this situation getting much worse than it is right now.
And that was McGill political science professor Rex Brynan, and it's interesting to note that in his scenario there, that's almost exactly what happened. I spoke to him the day before the drone was shot down, and that almost led to exactly the scenario he was predicting. There was an action, and there was almost this overreaction by the United States. And as we've learned today, President Trump called off that retaliatory strike with just minutes to spare. The planes apparently were in the air already and heading towards their targets in Iran. So it's still a very delicate situation.
It is, and it's very interesting that we were watching the press conference yesterday with Prime Minister Trudeau in the White House, and even then Donald Trump seemed to give the Iranians a way out, kind of suggesting that, well, this was a big mistake, but it was, done by some general or something like that. So it was almost as he was looking for an excuse not to, ratchet up the tensions even more than he already has.
But then the interesting thing, again, this keeps unfolding because, as you mentioned, President Trump said, well, maybe it was an accident, some rogue general, I should say. Then the Iranians came out and said, no, we deliberately targeted, but we could have shot down another plane which was nearby the drone or following the drone, which had people on board, but we didn't. So that suggests that in fact it was a very deliberate attack on the drone. But
I would be very skeptical of that claim, because I don't know whether the Iranian anti-aircraft systems are sophisticated enough to distinguish between a drone like the one that they shot down, which resembles a lot
a jet.
a jet. It's basically a jet drone.
And these drones are big.
Big.
They're not like
and
little.
a jet fighter.
Yeah.
I mean, we had the anniversary, or upcoming the anniversary of the MH17 flight, the Malaysia Airlines flight that was shot down by the Russian-backed rebels allegedly over eastern Ukraine. And there's been a lot of speculation was that the reason that they targeted the plane was that they thought this was a military plane, Ukrainian military transport plane. So for the Iranians to, claim that they can distinguish between a fighter plane and such a big drone that resembles the signature, it flies almost the same speed, as high, I have doubts about that.
Well, they said that the plane was carrying like 35 people, so it wasn't a fighter jet that they apparently or allegedly was following the drone. But then you have to ask yourself, why would another plane be following the drone? The whole point of the drone is to be able to stay away from things,
Well, if it was a spy plane, for example, that would fit 35 people. That's what probably fits into
an AWACS
or another kind of a spy plane. But
I don't know.
very, 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 very dangerous developments there.
Absolutely. We'll find out more about that. Hopefully, as Rex Bryan said in the interview, if you want to hear the full interview, he said there were a lot of diplomats and so on trying to calm everything down from around the world. Diplomats are going to various sources and saying, slow down. Anyway, we're going to find out about Canadian opinion on human rights coming up in just a moment. Well, on Monday, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, released new guidelines for Canadian diplomats abroad. And these new guidelines offer practical advice for Canadian diplomats on how to support human rights defenders worldwide. And this is your story, Levance. Tell us more.
Actually, these new guidelines are called Voices at Risk. And they update a series of guidelines that the Liberal government issued back in 2016. Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland says human rights defenders in many parts of the world are at great risk as a result of their work and their willingness to speak truth to power. For some reaction on these new guidelines, I spoke with Jackie Hansen. She's a human rights campaigner with Amnesty International Canada, the Canadian branch of this international NGO. And she says Amnesty International welcomes these new guidelines. Hansen says they include some stronger details, much more specific details on what exactly is expected of Canadian diplomats in their support to human rights defenders when, people come to them for help. What is it that Canadian diplomats are supposed to do? And she says the support for human rights defenders is desperately needed right now.
Well, according to the organization Frontline Defenders, 321 human rights defenders in 27 countries were targeted and killed for their work in 2018. Now, that's only activists who were murdered. So many more, not even hundreds, but thousands of activists around the world have been harassed, have been marginalized because of their work. Some have been forced to flee their countries of origin because of their work. So this is an incredibly dire situation, and what we've seen is as populism is rising around the world, the space for civil society to peacefully advocate for basic human rights protections is getting smaller and smaller. And the activists who continue to do this work to expose human rights violations and promote protection, respect for human rights, they're incredibly and increasingly at risk.
Now, when we talk about this human rights defenders, who are they and what are they advocating for?
So human rights defenders are anyone who is peacefully advocating for human rights. So this includes journalists, it includes lawyers, it includes labor leaders, it includes grassroots activists. It includes people advocating on a range of human rights issues, from women's rights to LGBTI rights to people advocating for corporate accountability, people advocating for rights to land and territory, environmental rights. And so basically it's people who, some are volunteers, some are doing this as part of their paid work, and it's people who are advocating for justice and equality and human rights, things that they should be lauded for, and instead they're threatened.
And that was an excerpt of my conversation with Jackie Hansen. She's a human rights campaigner with Amnesty International Canada.
Any indication of exactly what the diplomats are supposed to do, or is this just a general thing saying, you got to be more careful?
No, there's a whole list, and I actually included a link to the actual details of this in my story. So it goes for pages. Anything to do with how to support them, how to make sure that they're secure, because it's all around questions of security, about letting people who could target them, that these people are not alone, that there'll be consequences internationally for this kind of actions targeting them. There's also things like offering when the situation gets out of hand, offering these people assistance and help.
But doesn't that, in terms of how diplomacy works and the responsibility of diplomats and the official embassy staff and so on, isn't there kind of a very fine line of what you can do as opposed to actually helping? Because helping would be interfering, and that might be perceived as interfering in internal affairs of a country. And
absolutely, and this is a very fine line that Canadian diplomats or Western diplomats have to walk every time they interfere in these issues, because most of the time, especially if these people are not Canadian citizens, there's very little ability under international law that Canadian diplomats have, apart from making sure that these countries, the companies, the people who put pressure on these human rights defenders know that these issues will get international resonance. That it's not gonna be basically swept under the carpet.
Well, we've seen some very strong reactions, for example, to a simple tweet by the foreign affairs minister in terms of Saudi reaction.
Absolutely.
And China, China's come out, basically saying, how dare you try to influence in internal affairs kind of thing.
And it shows really the limitations of what Canadian diplomats, or even any diplomat in another country can do, or influence they have on strictly local issues. But I think that one of the things that they also want to make sure is that these countries, most of them, have signed on to all these international conventions. So it's also basically reminding these governments that, while it's not just us interfering in your affairs, you have actually undertaken, by signing these conventions, to follow certain rules. And
well, anyway, if you want to find out more about that, go to the website under the highlights section, and Levon's report is there. We're going to go from politics to archaeology and ancient archaeology in the Arctic. So we've got all kinds of A's there. Ancient archaeology in the Arctic. That's coming up in just a moment. Okay, when we're talking about hyenas, we're not talking about people we know, but we often think of them as these creatures of the savannah and hot, dry environments surrounded by lions and elephants and so on. This apparently has not always been the case. And we have some new research that we know that ancient hyenas once actually lived here in Canada, and more precisely in the Canadian Arctic. And Matthew, this was your story. Tell us
Yes, so that's right, Mark. Thanks to two small, they're only a few centimeters long, Ice Age fossil teeth discovered discovered in Yukon, which is in the Canadian Arctic Circle. So the study conducted by the University at Buffalo revealed that they belong to the so-called running hyena chasmaporthetes. So it's a really rare species of hyena. But what's interesting as well with this story is that these fossils are not a new discovery in itself. They found them more than 40 years ago, approximately 40 years, in the 70s, when a lot of scientists made a lot of expeditions there and they gathered tens of thousands of fossils. But the thing is, they focused more on mammoth and big mammals, like big animals. And those two little teeth that were pretty rare, they just thought they were belonging to some kind of hyena. And they stored them in the Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa and left them for years. And it's only last February when Jack Tseng, who's the first author of the study and an assistant professor of pathology and anatomical sciences at the University of Buffalo, came to Canada's capital. And he came to compare the two fossils to a global sample of hyena fossils found elsewhere. And with this, he was able to determine exactly what this particular hyena was. And he told me about the importance of this discovery.
First of all, it tells us that although we've long suspected as a paleontology community that because we have hyena fossils on both sides of the Pacific, they are found in North America as well as Asia, they must have crossed over Beringia, the northern region between Yukon, Alaska, and Siberia at one point. It's just that we've never had physical evidence to show when and how that migration or immigration may have occurred. And these two fossils essentially gave us now hard evidence that these hyenas were not only able to travel through that region. Perhaps they were there or they lived there up in the Yukon, the Arctic Circle, long enough that they were actually preserved as fossils. And that changes our basic assumption about how hyenas are able to live. If we compare all living hyenas today, they're mostly found in drier, lower latitude regions, so closer to the equator, and they live on open plains with lots of other animals, both prey and predator. But compare that to what we know about the Arctic region where these hyenas were found. It was an environment with much lower biodiversity, and of course the environmental conditions were much harsher. So it is kind of unusual, and I guess now that it makes us rethink, just how adaptable hyenas were, to go from living in the equator in some species to these Arctic hyenas being able to, hunt and survive in those harsh winters.
Now scientists will try to understand how these hyena, which arrived in North America about 5 million years ago, completely disappeared from the continent 4 million years later, as Zheng Sang explained to me.
This species of North American hyena in general existed on this continent for about 4 million years. That's not a long time for a mammal species. On average, a mammal species can survive for a couple million years in the fossil record. And for them, it could have been a combination of factors that led to their extinction. In our study, we have identified several potential competitors. These are other predators like bone-cracking canids in the dog family, wolf, or predecessors of modern wolves, hunting dog-like predators, as well as a gigantic short-faced bear. Any of those, or a combination of those, could have been in direct competition with the species of hyenas somewhere in North America. Perhaps maybe up in the Arctic, perhaps also elsewhere. And that may have led to the hyena's extinction. Maybe they just couldn't outcompete these other predators, or maybe the environment was changing. Either it got even colder, or maybe resources dried up. So those are at this point speculations as to why they went away. North American hyenas were ranging all the way from the Arctic down to Mexico. What made them go away? I mean, they apparently they seemed very successful at one time because they, regardless whether it's a warm environment in Mexico or a very cold environment up in the Arctic, they were able to survive long enough to be fossilized. So that's an open question for us right now.
That was Jack Tseng, Assistant Professor of Pathology and Anatomical Sciences at the University at Buffalo. And then I asked him, are you going to go there and try to find out? And try, because the thing is, they only found those 2 teeth. And to know more about how they disappeared, they need to find another fossil, a bigger fossil, a head, a leg, or the corpse entirely. And he told me, well, if I'm invited, I'll go, of course. And then he said that they're doing a lot of expeditions every year, and they've done so for 10 years, even more now. And they still haven't found any other pieces of this kind of hyena in the Arctic.
Huh. Interesting. You'd think if they'd been around for 4 million years, there'd be lots and lots of evidence of that. Even as he was saying that, I'm wondering if this might not have been the case of some larger creature, like a bear, that had eaten a hyena somewhere and came to this thing and
excreted the teeth.
Well, as you say, with 2 teeth for 4 million years?
Yeah.
I don't know. But
I mean, there's a lot of, with climate change now and permafrost melting, there's new layers that are going to be opening up.
Yeah.
So it's very possible that we'll have, layers that are currently completely frozen at some point will come out on the surface and reveal some other. I mean, I'm just surprised that by these 2 teeth, the scientists were able to determine that these are hyenas, and so it just.
But that's modern science for you. I mean, they could with genetics and DNA and everything else. Right?
It took them 40 years to find someone specialized in hyenas and go to Ottawa and compare them with others they found in Mexico and in south of North America. But the thing is, maybe they will also find some at the Canadian border with the United States, because this entire...
Like Alaska, you mean?
Yeah. Or even like just south of Ottawa, because this entire region, they haven't found any, and they lived in between the Arctic region and Mexico, so maybe they also lived in the middle. So there's a lot to do for them now.
And the wolves are saying, look at the new neighbors. We got to get rid of them. All right, we're going to, on that happy note, we're going to go back in history a bit. And this is a story that you helped me with. Yeah. And this is a story about basketball, because, of course, basketball has been big with the Raptors and so on. What is the story then?
Exactly. Well, I was really interested in your story. You wrote, actually, I didn't give the link to Pierre because you had great pictures, and I think the people should go and take a look at your story, which was about the Edmonton commercial grads. So they're a women basketball team that was created, actually, the anniversary of its creation was this week on the June 19th. Mm-hmm. So they were created and they played for 40 years, and they had a 25-year win streak, right? So they were world champions for 25 years. And they actually, I saw some archive videos, and they actually had welcoming parties, almost just as big as the Raptors, really. You could see the city being, waiting for them and having, they were really big stars, and you could see they played in Europe. They played in, for Olympics, and they won. They won every single game they played in the Olympics, and they didn't get medals because, here we go. We're going to see them play. They're the ones with the black shorts. So I just thought, that looks pretty...
Basketball fashions have changed.
Yeah.
Well, no, this is what was interesting, though. But when they started to play, of course, women were wearing bloomers, and they had big woolen socks and knee pads and so on. And the funny thing was, when they played, the first time they played against the Americans were dressed in shorts with T-shirts. And the thing was, there was a comment somewhere where the Americans had world champs written on their shorts. And the Canadian players says, well, we're going to take that away from them. Yeah. And they did. In fact, the interesting thing is, this is probably, in sports history, the most winningest team ever.
Yeah.
They have an over 96% win rate. And, what other team in history has ever had a 96% plus?
But was this like a city team or a college team?
It was originally like a high school type college thing. It was a commercial college. At the time, it was for women who were going to be secretaries and things. They learned how to be commercial people. Yeah.
And once their studies were finished, they asked their coach, can we pursue that? Can we, become a real team, keep playing and playing in championships and stuff? And he agreed. And even the creator of basketball, which is a Canadian inventor,
Naismith, yeah.
Yeah, he told he sent him a note, and he said, "You're an inspiration," and so that's pretty impressive. We also have another video, which is from the Alberta Museum. Do we have time? No, we don't.
No, we're almost out of time.
Okay, so another time.
But
I'll put the links.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're interested in that and this amazing bit of factoid of Canadian and sports history, go to the website, take a look at that story.
And they ended up writing "World Champ" on their shorts.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. So for Marie-Claude and Matthew and Levon, and in the control room, Pierre and Carl and Benoit, I'm Mark Montgomery. Take care until next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.